Good evening, welcome to my channel. You'll see I'm in my new surrounds and I've managed to get my books and things out, so made the place a little bit more convivial. It's really hot, so forgive me for looking a little casual and being a bit sweaty. It's about 95 degrees. Anyway, I've written a short story. It's not 1,000 words, a little bit longer. And it's based as ever on 5 random words, which are, and this story is called Duet. 3 months into lockdown, Stella had settled into a comfortable and comforting routine. Stuck in her compact 3rd floor flat in a line of Victorian terraces in West London, she was concentrating on writing songs for her debut album. Her day began at 8 AM with coffee and toast and some vocal warm-ups before she kept her voice in shape with a few choice covers, performed to backing tracks she found online. Stella would video some of these for her YouTube channel, which gratifyingly had received a spike in subscribers since lockdown began. She'd recently celebrated her 10,000th follower. Eclectic in taste, her 3 biggest tracks were Al Green's How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, No Surprises by Radiohead, and Adele's Hello. Her own songs tended towards the melancholy, particularly since her breakup with boyfriend of the past 5 years, Tony. A few weeks previously, as Stella had been preparing to record a version of Let's Go Out Tonight, a little-known heartbreaker by cult Scottish band The Blue Nile, she heard a rich velvety voice issuing from the flat next door, singing something operatic and Italian. Singing remarkably well, despite the accompaniment of an occasional crashing she could only imagine was the sound of a large, clumsy man putting pots and pans away. In part, this image was aided by the fact that Stella had a couple of times bumped into her new neighbour a week or so before the pandemic started, both times in the hallway outside their flats. On the first occasion, the man, in his early 50s and very overweight, had been struggling upstairs with an armful of pot plants from the nearby garden centre, Stella guessed. He'd fought to fish his keys out of his pocket, and Stella had been too slow to offer to help. The second time she'd seen Mr. Adamson, Stella had seen his name on the mail, he'd been rushing downstairs, immaculately dressed in a tuxedo and white bow tie. Stella had offered, "Nice suit," in passing, a daft understatement which was meant as a genuine compliment. Her neighbour had grinned, taking the comment in the spirit in which it was intended. Now, listening to Mr. Adamson sing, Stella suddenly understood the meaning of the tuxedo. Her neighbour was an operatic tenor, presumably on the way to a concert, in the vintage Alfa Romeo she'd seen parked outside. As she listened to the tenor's aria, a melancholy, floating, drifting melody, she later discovered was Donizetti after much googling. Stella's initial annoyance that her latest video couldn't be recorded gave way to grudging admiration. Mr. Adamson could really sing. Her googling had not thrown up any famous tenors of that name, so she guessed, like her, he was firmly in the category of gifted amateur, albeit one able to play the kind of gigs that required dress shirt and tails. Someone she had at first dismissed as an eccentric old goat was recast in her imagination in an entirely new light. The following day, Stella heard Mr. Adamson doing his own warm-up exercises, a series of rising and falling scales in a variety of keys. She wondered if, like her, he had perfect pitch, or whether he used an app or tuning fork to hit the right starting note. She found herself falling into unison with him, rising and falling in sync with his notes, albeit in a higher register. After a few minutes of this, Mr. Adamson seemed to stop mid-scale. Had he heard her? Stella decided she didn't care and finished the set of scales anyway. Later that afternoon, Stella heard Mr. Adamson singing the same Donizetti aria on his balcony. She felt a little too shy to step out there to listen, so she stood behind the billowing curtain in the overheated room and listened to the street applauding his efforts. Even the workmen digging up the road below had downed their tools, Stella could see, peering through her curtains. Of course, she added her own applause to the impromptu audiences. Suffering as she did from both Crohn's disease and a mild form of agoraphobia, Stella had scarcely been outside for days, but later that evening she decided to venture out onto her own balcony, which she mostly used for drying laundry. Pushing the rack of skirts and skimpy tops to one side, she closed her eyes, leaned against the doorframe, and sang "If You Go Away," the English lyrics of the magnificently over-the-top Jacques Brel song she'd played on constant rotation in the week following her breakup. The street outside was quiet, and Stella didn't really care if anyone was listening or not. Halfway through the song, a strange, low descant seemed to join her voice. Stella realised it was Mr. Adamson humming a low accompaniment, above which her own voice floated like a seabird drifting upon a dark ocean. It was strangely self-effacing, given what Stella knew his voice was capable of, but it really added a powerful underscore to the song. After the last "If You Go Away" faded, a rapturous applause followed, and Stella opened her eyes to see with astonishment a small gathering of people on the balconies across the street and on the pavements below. All were looking up at her and clapping. Stella turned to applaud Mr. Adamson, who was standing beaming broadly on his tiny balcony. "Take a bow, my dear. You are magnificent," he said, making Stella's day. Thus they finally broke the ice between them and began chatting, daily, between their balconies, about music, performance, lyrics, work, and many unrelated topics. Mr. Adamson gifted her one of his plants, a small rosebush. In return, Stella loaned him the cookery book in which he'd found the recipe for cheese scones, after he commented on the delicious smell wafting out of her kitchen window. She later passed over a Tupperware box containing 3 scones. They began to duet across their balconies on pop songs after Stella confessed she couldn't read music. "What a shame," Mr. Adamson said. "I have the perfect Donizetti duet." Stella was flattered but bemused by the very idea of singing opera. After all, she had no formal training in such music and knew little or nothing about it. "Hush, dear, you're a natural," her neighbour said, "but we can stick to Simon and Garfunkel if you prefer." Thus they essayed Bridge Over Troubled Water, The Boxer, and America before moving on to Cole Porter, Something Stupid, and Body and Soul. Stella didn't try to foist anything too modern on Mr. Adamson, whose popular music taste didn't extend much into this millennium, and Mr. Adamson didn't try to push any Italian opera on Stella, although she loved hearing him sing it. Like Stella, and seemingly like a lot of people in the transient neighbourhood of Earl's Court, Mr. Adamson lived alone, and presumably he was also having a hard time with this period of self-isolation, being a confirmed bachelor. Stella suspected he was gay and that there was tragedy in his romantic history, but she didn't pry. Knocking on his door to offer him a cup of tea might be forbidden, but they could at least converse across their respective balconies, in words and via their shared love of song. Then, one day in early June, the duet stopped. Stella no longer saw Mr. Adamson around, and she wondered if he had moved away, or taken advantage of things opening up a little to go and visit friends or relatives. It was only when she heard unfamiliar voices from the apartment next door that she decided to investigate. Venturing out into the hall, she tiptoed to the door of flat 7 and listened intently. A male and female voice could be heard talking in low tones. "I guess the rest can go to charity." "Whatever. Look, do you want the filing cabinet?" Before knowing quite why, Stella knocked on the door. When it was opened, she found herself face to face with a large-boned and rather plain girl in her mid-20s who was clearly Mr. Adamson's daughter, a fact that was both incontrovertible and surprising. The likeness unsettled Stella a little and made her fumble her words. She backed away to an appropriate distance. I'm sorry to disturb. I'm from next door. I hadn't seen Mr. Adamson around. Is he okay?" As soon as Stella finished her question, the answer was evident from the girl's expression. Sophie revealed that her father had suffered breathing difficulties in the middle of the night a couple of weeks previously and had been taken by ambulance to hospital and there diagnosed with COVID-19. He was put on a ventilator and treated assiduously by his nurses, but died after several days of struggling on life support. Adamson's funeral had been held yesterday, and today Sophie and her fiancé Mike were going through his possessions and deciding what was to be done with them. Hearing this, Stella felt a strange sense of dislocation. Her last memory of Mr. Adamson was of him in full voice, belting out a rendition of Amazing Grace that drew an audience of several dozen wildly applauding neighbours and passers-by. To imagine those fine lungs choked and ruined by virus in a matter of 10 days seemed bizarre and frightening. True, she had heard him coughing now and again through the wall between their flats, but it hadn't seemed unusual or life-threatening. Stella found herself ending the conversation rather abruptly, with a promise to keep in touch. Sophie and Mike had some notions about holding a memorial concert for their father, and perhaps Stella could sing. Sophie and Mike seemed lovely and said they recognised her from the YouTube links their father had sent them. They had been meaning to knock on her door to thank her for enriching their father's last days. Stella felt touched but also a little embarrassed. It wasn't as if she'd got to know her neighbour especially well, save for their shared love of music. Nevertheless, she agreed to contribute to the memorial and then decided to pay him a personal tribute. Of course, there was only one composer she could choose to celebrate her neighbour. As she couldn't read music and had little practical knowledge of singing in an operatic style, Stella set about learning new techniques and memorising a piece by Donizetti by ear. It was a beautiful and sad aria from his opera about Lucia of Lammermoor, and it involved only a limited range of vocal pyrotechnics. Nevertheless, Stella took a full 2 weeks to reach a standard she felt able to submit to public scrutiny, and even then on just the first 3.5 minutes of the piece. She set up her phone on the balcony, propped up against some books, and plugged in her vocal microphone. Then she started the video recording and said the following. This song is for my neighbour, Mr. Adamson, who sadly passed away from coronavirus a few weeks ago. I wanted to perform a piece by one of his favourite composers, and although I'm not an operatic soprano, I'll try my best to do it justice. Then she began to sing, filling her lungs with life-giving air, forcing it through her straining vocal cords, letting the notes resonate deeply in her chest. Stella sang like she never had before, and people stopped in the street and squinted up against the sunlight. She could still feel Adamson's eyes on her somehow, although she didn't turn to look at his balcony, for fear of seeing him there, or for sorrow at his absence. Stella's high, pure voice cut through traffic and building work sounds. It stopped people in their tracks and echoed in the terraced streets. Stella sang of tragic loss and regret, and her voice bore testimony to her loss and the world's. And that is my story. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, as ever, feel free to subscribe, maybe watch another one, and share the story. Please let other people hear it. And I will see you soon. Bye-bye.